Hello everybody, welcome back. Thanks for tuning in to another episode in the series here. This episode, I know for the past two episodes of the season now I've said that that was the last episode in the season, and here we are with one more episode. So I guess I apologize for going back and forth like that, but hopefully it's not too much of a burden considering we're just going to, continue exploring new features and functionalities, and in this case specifically about epoxy. So this actually came from a comment and a little bit of a discussion that I had with one of the members of the community, Pratik. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, so thank you for inquiring about this, asking about it, and I'm happy to make a video about it. So we've covered here in this Senya travel application handling horizontally, or in this case here we have vertically, and then horizontally scrolling lists and supporting them through the epoxy controller. Well, another popular, I guess, form of layout management is with the, or is in the grid fashion. So we're going to go ahead and actually implement that today for you to kind of just round out the opportunities that you have with a recycler view, explain to you or show you how simple it is to kind of change between these different options, between a linear list and a grid list, and then of course, kind of enhance this section of the UI here for our detail screen, which we have kind of left the same for when we created it, and it worked for the time being, but we can make it a little bit better with some of the knowledge that we have here. So I'm going to go ahead and create some of the XML files that and layout files that we need to accomplish this, because currently we have our layout file pretty static here, right, for the detail fragment. We have our recycler view, which allows us a little bit of flexibility, but then everything after that is a static title, a static description, a static months to visit, and this little facts text view thing. And it works, but it works mainly because this description on all of our attractions doesn't get too long. But if it were to basically be larger than the size of the screen here, we need to support scrolling, and we don't really do that in a comfortable manner at the moment. So I'm going to go ahead and just change that, update that, make it a little bit more flexible and intelligent, and then I'll be back in a few. So enjoy the time lapse. Okay, so welcome back everybody. I guess you saw me do all of it, but in case you missed it, we created a bunch of new layout files here for all the different pieces of our screen that we're going to be rebuilding here. So if we take a look at, having the description, having the months to visit, having this little facts thing that we're actually going to change, we've converted this entire area here beneath this header text to be an epoxy recycler view. So we need to go ahead and create our models for all of the different views that we're going to put inside of this area to fill this UI and make it look something like it currently does. So we've gone ahead and just created a little facts header, a fact item itself that's actually wrapped in a card view, the months to visit, and then the description text, which basically were copied from the detail fragment, and then you can see the detail fragment layout, and then you can see here that we have the epoxy recycler view underneath here, and nothing else. So I've gone ahead and created the beginning of the controller and the various data classes acting as the epoxy models here that are matching up with all of the new layout files that we created. They're all pretty straightforward and very simple, just actually needing the correct strings to post. And I kind of wanted to make these models redundant here to drive home the fact that or make all these layout files here instead of just like one that could you could use to format differently, just to kind of drive home the fact that we can build our UI in sequence in this build models function with however many view types we want, because we know how epoxy works and whatnot. So we go ahead and actually implement the build models here. So we're going to change things up slightly. We're just going to actually add the months to visit first. So we're just going to get, and then the attraction itself that we're looking at is part of the constructor. So we're just going to go ahead and get the months to visit text there. We got to give these different IDs. So we're just going to go ahead and kind of name them, how they, I guess how we could think about them. So we'll go ahead and add our months to visit. Then we will go ahead and add our description epoxy model. Then we need our facts header. We need to properly format this string. And then finally, we will go ahead and loop through each of our facts here and add them in. So we're going to go ahead and say fact epoxy model with the fact, sorry, that does not need to be plural. ID is going to be fact underscore index, add to this. Okay, so this epoxy controller will go ahead and build our UI accordingly, and now we just need to actually implement it here. So we removed a whole bunch of things, so we actually don't, really have them anymore, but we will we'll keep this in case we want to reuse it, but then everything else here is taken care of for us in the controller we just built here. So we're just going to say binding.content epoxy recycler view, set controller and build models, the content epoxy controller, and then our attraction that we're listening to here from our live data. So let's go ahead and just give this a run real quick and see how things wind up. Okay, and we're back here loading our data, and then if we click on Sally, we can actually see here our content that exists here on the screen. So it can definitely use a little bit of cleanup, but at first glance, this screen looks a whole lot better than it used to look here. So let me go ahead and just tweak some things and get some things up to standard for what I would like, and then we will resume from there. Okay, so we have I've tweaked it a little bit here, kind of updated a few things here. Maybe go ahead and just make some little text sizes a bit bigger here. But other than that, things seem to be, you know, kind of kind of coming together here. Quite happy with the how this is all turning out, and hopefully you can kind of see the power of creating a entirely different looking layout just based on using the epoxy controller and using the different models. I don't know if you noticed, but we moved this months to visit kind of thing all the way to the bottom here, and that was literally just a matter of changing where we were adding this epoxy model to our controller. Instead of it being first, we now have it last, and we get a whole new or a different UI. So it's quite powerful to just quickly change things on a whim, and hopefully that is just more and more apparent. Really quickly here, I'm just going to put some padding bottom on the 24dp, or 24dp as a padding bottom. And so yeah, we can actually end up scrolling a tiny bit, so you can see that now this screen is going to allow you to scroll completely, and we can support a whole lot more data being shown here than just this. But it's been quite a long video at this point, and I haven't done anything with the grid that we discussed here. So as you can see here in our content epoxy recycler view, we have a layout manager of the linear layout manager. So we're going to go ahead and just change this to be the grid layout manager. And then let's say we want to have two these facts next to one another. So we would have, instead of 4 one after another, we'll have 2 rows of 2. We can do that by setting what's called the span count here, and we'll set it to 2. So span count is really just the number of columns that you want, and as you can see in this little editor, it actually does that for you in real time, and you can see item 0 is top left, and then item 1 is top right, and then 2 and 3 are on the following line, and 4 and 5. So you can actually, instead of them all being in a single list, it's going to read left to right, and then down as well. So if we were to up this to, let's say, span count of 5, you can see how that would change this layout as well. Span count is something that you can change dynamically as well, which can create some interesting effects if that's what you're looking for. But usually you kind of know what you want the span to be, so it's just easiest to set it in the XML and not have to worry about it. So we're going to go ahead and just rerun this and see what we end up looking like when we reach our details page again. All right, take a look at that grid layout. That looks horrible, right? I mean, what on earth is going on here? Well, we've set to 2. We set the span to 2 here, and so it's pretty apparent that there are now 2 columns here that exist in this recycler view. However, we haven't really done anything to instruct which or how we want each epoxy model to handle itself when we have a span count of something other than 1. You can imagine a vertically or horizontally scrolling list as and having the linear layout manager as a span count of just 1. So by default, the epoxy controller, or the epoxy models, excuse me, actually know their span count, but they default to 1 because they anticipate that, that's the default, that you're usually going to be using a linear layout manager, and if you're going to be doing something with grid fashion, you're going to have to instruct each one of these epoxy models how much room you want it to take up. So fortunately, on the epoxy model, there is a function that you can override here called getSpanSize, and there are a few parameters that are passed into you: the total span count, the position, and then the item count, and you need to return an int. And so if we say, if we look at super, which exists in the epoxy model base class, it just returns 1, right? So this epoxy model here, this epoxy model, and everything that you see on the screen here is all saying, hey, we only have, we're only supposed to take up 1 span in our epoxy recycler view, but in this case, we're actually setting it to have a span of 2. So that's why you get this 1/2 feature. So we can very easily here just figure out what we want our span size to be for each model, and then everything will work. So we want our months to visit to take up the entire screen. So we're going to go ahead, and we know that it's 2 is our span count, but we could possibly change that if, say, we want to end up supporting 3 columns or something along those lines. So instead of hard coding 2 here, we can actually return total span count, which if we were to change, the span count in the XML or change it programmatically, when this function gets called, it passes in the new value. So let's say we change it to 3, it would pass in 3, and then we would return 3, telling epoxy that this model wants to take up all of the columns that exist in the recycler view. And we're going to do this for all of them except the actual fact itself. We are going to leave that one as 1 because, as you can see here, this is starting to look the way that we want it to. So if we just go ahead and rebuild this, I don't know if it'll let me apply changes. Yeah, because we added a new function or overrode a function, we need to restart the entire application. And so now if we click on our thing here, boom, we are back to normal here. And so this is actually, this list here looks like it might just be, at first glance, a text view here, a grid layout here, and then more text view down here. But in reality, this is one cohesive scrolling unit inside our epoxy recycler view, which gives us just tremendous power to actually build a fluid UI here. And now you can see not only are we mixing and matching view types here by defining and adding different epoxy models to the controller, but we are also mixing span counts, and we're coming up with this very elegant and interesting UI here that is much more appealing than what we started this episode with. I'm going to quickly see if I can just clean this up here. I think we're running into the issue of... Alright, so after playing around with it for a little bit, seemed to kind of clean a couple of things up, but it's not absolutely perfect. In order to get it perfect, it would actually require a little bit more work, the way I'm thinking about doing it, and I don't really want to jump into that right now. I think the focus of this video was for the grid layout, and then we kind of enhanced our UI here a little bit. So the last thing that I want to kind of go over or handle, if you will, is this little interaction here. I don't know if you saw it during the time lapse, but I had the grid, I fetched the grid icon and then also the list icon with the intention of being able to toggle between the two different kinds of layouts. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of explore that to see if we can get it to function as we would expect. Okay, so I needed to think about things and just regroup on how I was going to do this. So we've changed the implementation a tiny bit, but it isn't all that bad. So we have defined a variable here is grid mode to be a Boolean to determine if the current layout manager is a grid layout manager. And we go ahead and actually create our epoxy controller with the attraction that we had, passed in from our live data. Then we actually need to set this field here on our epoxy controller because I'll explain why in a minute, but we need to basically notify the controller what mode it's in, and because we only have two, we're just using a Boolean to flip between them. And then we implemented here an onChangeLayout callback, which gets invoked when the user clicks on this little icon here. When that does get clicked, we have to run some logic here and says if we're in grid mode, then we're going to go ahead and just change our layout manager to be the linear layout manager. Otherwise, that means we are, if this Boolean is set to false, that means we are in the linear layout. So we're going to go ahead and set it to the grid layout manager. And here is how you can define how many, what your span count is going to be programmatically. And that is a required field for your for this constructor of the layout manager. Then we're going to go ahead and just flip our flag to whatever the opposite value of what it's currently set to. We need to update that field in our epoxy controller, and then we say request model build, which will rerun everything and then redraw the models on screen. So we've gone ahead and added these two variables here to the epoxy controller itself to determine if it is in the grid mode, and then a latenit variable to for the callback. We actually pass both of these fields into our fax header epoxy model, and with that we can, on click of the actual image view, we just invoke our callback so that we bubble up these events. And then the is grid mode flag here, we simply just set the corresponding image. So it says if we are in grid mode, we're going to set the list icon, and otherwise we'll set the grid icon. So that is why currently this is a grid, but you see a list. And so if you were to actually tap this, you can see that it changes the layout manager, redraws everything, and as part of that, it also redraws this icon as well. So you can just quickly toggle between these two different states as far as what I guess are looking for. Very quickly, I haven't done this yet, but if we were to just change this to 3, the idea here is that all this stuff should work as intended. And there you go. Now you have 3, doesn't look great, but you now have 3 columns. All of these things here stayed the same, right? Instead of hard coding 2, we returned the total span count, so we don't have to worry about what it actually is. It just takes up the entire span, and you can just toggle between these two like it's nothing here. So I'm just going to set this back to 2 because that's what we actually want, and then this will conclude our little tutorial here on the grid layout manager and further the understanding of how to actually use epoxy to build these very interesting UIs here that can look quite complex on the surface maybe, or also look very simple, but then they can be a little complex behind the scenes, whichever way you want to look at it. But it's definitely the way to go to build anything that you're looking for, especially in any kind of dynamic nature. And then something like this is just super convenient and nice to have. So I thank you, Pratik, for suggesting this content here. I think it has turned out pretty well. I apologize, it's probably a little bit of a lengthier video. It took me a while to record this and put it all together, but there you have it. We have some pretty concrete example of how to actually use the Grid Layout Manager properly. So hope you learned something. If you did, please smash that like button. Please subscribe. I'd greatly appreciate it. And I'll catch you in the next one. Thanks.